They had the estate sold before he was even in the ground. She had no say. No one did. Until the workers broke through. What had been sealed inside those walls changed everything she thought she knew. And once the town saw what fell out of that plaster, nobody laughed at her again. Margaret Ashworth stands at the end of the gravel drive, 3 days after her husband's funeral, watching Philip Ashworth's carriage pull away from the house she was just told is no longer hers. The wheels crunch over loose stone, the black lacquer catches morning light, and Philip doesn't look back, not once. Because why would he? He got what he came for before Thomas was cold. Let me tell you about the marriage first, because you need to understand what was taken. Thomas and Margaret Ashworth lived at Fenwick Hall for 11 years, 14 rooms, 6 acres of ground sloping south toward the river. Built in 1790 by a man who wanted thick walls and deep cellars, and that's exactly what he got. The house wasn't beautiful, it was solid. Grey stone, slate roof, windows that rattled in February but held. The kind of place that doesn't impress anyone on first glance and outlasts everything that does. Thomas was 44 when the stroke took him. A Tuesday morning. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand on the frame, talking about the fence posts along the south meadow needing replacement. Then he wasn't talking anymore. Then he was on the floor. Then he was gone. That fast. That ordinary. A man mid-sentence, and then silence where a life used to be. Margaret pulled her charcoal wool coat tight around her shoulders and walked to the village for the doctor. The coat was already patched at the left elbow with slightly mismatched grey thread. She'd done it herself that winter. It was too thin for the season then, and it's too thin now, standing at the end of this drive, watching Philip's carriage disappear around the bend. Philip Ashworth arrived within hours. Not the next day, hours. Like he'd been waiting. His black frock coat was pressed sharp enough to cut paper, the silver watch chain gleaming across his waistcoat, and he consulted that pocket watch twice before he even stepped inside. Steel grey hair combed back with pomade so precise it looked painted on. Gold wire-rimmed spectacles catching the lamplight as he spread documents across Thomas's own desk. Thomas's desk, still warm from Thomas's hands, and explained in that clipped, measured voice that the estate had never been jointly held. "You must understand, Margaret." He said her name like he was addressing a servant who'd overstayed. Thomas was sentimental. Sentiment is not law. The property reverts to the family line, and the family line has made its decision. The family line, meaning Philip, meaning one man with thin lips and hollow cheeks and a pointed chin who looked at Margaret like she was a stain on upholstery he planned to sell. She asked about the will. Philip produced papers. She asked about her rights as a widow. Philip produced more papers. The family solicitor sat in the corner, a man named Garrett, who'd known Margaret for a decade, and he looked at the floor, didn't speak, didn't object, just studied his own shoes like they contained scripture. 3 days, that's all it took. Philip arranged the auction. Fenwick Hall, 14 rooms, 6 acres, sold to a developer named Havisham for a price so far below value it was practically a joke. Havisham wanted the interiors, the oak panelling, the marble mantels, the iron railings. Gut it for salvage, sell the bones of a house that had stood for over a century. Nobody contested. Nobody bid against Havisham because nobody was told the auction was happening until it was done. Philip moved with the efficiency of a man who'd planned this long before his brother's heart stopped. Margaret was given one trunk, her clothes, a few personal items Philip deemed sufficiently personal, meaning worthless, meaning nothing he could sell. She stood in the hallway of her own home while a stranger's men carried furniture past her, and Philip said one last thing before he climbed into that carriage. "You'll land on your feet, I'm sure. Women like you always do." Women like you. Like she was a category, a type, something to be filed and forgotten. She took a room at the posting inn in the village, 12 shillings a week, which she could afford for perhaps a month if she ate once a day. The room was narrow, the mattress thin and lumped in the center, one window that faced the stable yard. A single candle on the nightstand. The tarnished brass skeleton key on its thin leather cord hung beneath her cream linen blouse, resting against her sternum. Thomas's key, given to her on their wedding night with a half smile and the words, "For when you need it." It fit no lock she'd ever found in 11 years of living at Fenwick Hall. She sat on the edge of that bed, grey-green eyes fixed on the candle flame, and she did not cry. Not because she wasn't grieving, because grief was a luxury that cost time, and time was something Philip had made sure she couldn't afford. 4 days passed. On the 5th, a tradesman named Briggs came into the inn's common room for his evening ale. He'd been hired by Havisham's crew to help strip the east wing. Briggs sat 2 tables away and told another man, loud enough for the whole room, that the workers had broken through the east wall on the 2nd day and stopped dead. Dropped their tools mid-swing. Something was in there. Behind the plaster, behind the lath, sealed inside the wall cavity, like someone had bricked it up on purpose decades ago. Havisham pulled his men out and hadn't sent them back. Margaret set down her bread. She didn't finish her meal. She didn't ask Briggs a single question. The next morning, before dawn had fully committed to the sky, she walked the 2 miles back to Fenwick Hall in her scuffed black ankle boots with their worn heels. The gate was unchained. The front door was locked, but the kitchen door that had never latched properly, that Thomas always said he'd fix next month, swung open at her touch. She walks into the abandoned manor alone for the first time since the sale, finds the east wing corridor where workers left their tools mid-job, and sees the hole they punched in the wall, and the edge of something leather just visible inside the cavity. Margaret pulls the leather-bound ledger from inside the wall cavity, its pages stiff with damp and age, the date on the first entry, 1847. The weight of it surprises her, not heavy like a Bible or a family register, heavy like something that absorbed decades of moisture and intention in equal measure. The leather cover has gone dark, almost black, slick under her fingertips, where condensation beaded and beaded again across seasons nobody counted. She holds it against her charcoal wool coat, the one patched at the left elbow with mismatched grey thread, and the damp seeps through immediately, cold against her ribs. The smell hits next. Old leather, yes, but underneath that, wet chalk and iron, and something faintly sweet, like paper dissolving into its own dust. She cracks the cover open, and the spine resists, then gives with a sound like a small bone settling. The pages inside are written edge to edge in a precise, small hand. Tight, controlled. Every letter formed with the kind of discipline that speaks to someone who wrote by candlelight and couldn't afford to waste ink on careless strokes. Numbers. Columns of them. Dates down the left margin. January 1847, March 1847, June 1847. And beside each date, a name. Names she doesn't know. Hargreaves, Pemberton, Stott. Beside each name, a sum. £4, 8 shillings, £12, £3.10, and beside each sum, initials she can't decode, and a single phrase repeated with slight variations. Paid from the trust. Drawn against the second instrument, applied per the standing instruction. Page after page after page. The entries continue through 1848, 1849, 1850. Different names, the same careful hand, the same references to a trust she has never heard mentioned. A second instrument. Meaning what? A second will? A second deed? The sums grow larger as the years advance. £20 to someone called Whitfield in 1852, £36 to a Mrs. Durrant in 1854. Each one noted, dated, initialed. Here's what stops her cold. This is not Thomas's handwriting. Margaret knew her cousin's hand. She received exactly 4 letters from Thomas Ashworth in her life, each one brief and stiffly polite, and each one written in a loose, slanting script with oversized capitals. The hand in this ledger is nothing like that. Smaller, older in style. The ink itself is different. Iron gall, gone rusty brown with age, not the blue-black Thomas favored. Whoever kept this ledger used this house before Thomas inherited it. Someone who sat in one of these rooms with a candle and a pen and recorded every payment as though building a case for a court that might never convene. She reaches back into the cavity. The hole the workers punched goes deeper than she first thought. Her arm disappears past the elbow, past the wrist, until her fingers find cold stone at the back, and resting against it, a bundle. Letters, tied with waxed cord that has gone stiff but held. She pulls them free, and dust cascades down her sleeve, settling in the grey-green of her deep-set eyes until she blinks it away. The envelopes are addressed in a different hand again, a third person's writing, looser and more hurried. Each one directed to E.A. at this address, this house. The postmarks are legible on some, 1853, 1858, 1864, 1871. More than 20 letters, spanning 2 decades, all sent to a woman identified only by initials, all received here, all hidden in a wall. E.A. The brass skeleton key on its thin leather cord shifts against Margaret's collarbone as she straightens. She doesn't know an E.A. in the family. Nobody mentioned an E.A. Nobody mentioned any of this. Above her, the ceiling plaster has buckled in a long, diagonal crack running from the east wall to the center beam. Sheets of it have already fallen. She can see the lath beneath, dark with damp. Some slats split where the moisture froze and expanded over winters. The east wall itself weeps. Not dramatically, not a flood, just a constant film of wet running down the stone where the pointing has failed outside, carrying dissolved mortar in pale streaks that look like old tears dried halfway down a face. The smell in this corridor is wet stone and old lime, and something organic, something fungal, breathing quietly behind the walls. One window remains intact in this stretch of the east wing, a single pane of old glass, slightly warped, greenish, letting grey afternoon light through in a column that lands on the flagstone floor and illuminates exactly nothing useful. Every other window frame holds only air. The draft is constant and smells of rain. Something moves at the edge of her vision. A thin grey cat sits on the kitchen windowsill at the far end of the corridor. It does not startle. It does not leave. It watches her with the flat patience of an animal that has been waiting in an empty house longer than any person bothered to notice. Its ribs are visible beneath short fur gone dull with poor feeding. One ear carries an old notch, healed clean, months ago at least. It blinks once, stays. This cat lives here. Has lived here. Through the abandonment, the auction, the silence. It stayed when everything human left. Margaret holds its gaze for a moment, then looks back at the ledger in her hands. The letters tucked under her arm, the names she doesn't recognize, the trust she was never told existed. Boots on flagstone. Behind her, heavy, unhurried even, the stride of someone who knows this corridor and doesn't need to test the floor for rot. She turns. A man fills the doorway at the west end of the passage. Tall, 6'1" at least, broad-shouldered and solid in a faded olive canvas work coat over a collarless off-white shirt. His hair is dark sandy blonde, cropped short at the sides, pushed back from his forehead. Pale blue eyes, slightly hooded, taking in the scene without urgency. A folding carpenter's rule in pale boxwood sits visible in his coat breast pocket. He carries a lantern in his left hand, already lit though the afternoon hasn't fully died. Edward Hale appears in the corridor behind her without a word, sets a lantern on the floor, and says only, "The beam above you is cracked. Step left." Then he looks at the ledger in her hands, and his expression changes. Edward sets the lantern down and tells her the beam is cracked, practical, immediate. and then asks if she knows what EA stands for. His pale blue eyes hold on the ledger in her hands, and something shifts behind them. Not alarm, recognition. "Elizabeth Ashworth," he says. Plain, like reading a name off a headstone. "Your grandmother." Margaret's grey-green eyes lift from the page. The tarnished brass key rests against her collarbone beneath the cream linen blouse, and she feels its weight like a pulse. Edward Hale stands in the corridor, with the lantern throwing his shadow long behind him. Broad-shouldered, solid, the folding carpenter's rule visible in the breast pocket of his faded olive work coat. His hands hang at his sides, calloused. A pale scar runs across the knuckle of his right index finger, the kind a chisel leaves when it slips on cold mortar. He tells her, not everything, not yet, but enough. He was a tenant on the estate's north boundary, 40 years on that strip of land, first with his father, then alone after his father died. He knew Thomas Ashworth. He knew Elizabeth before Thomas. He knows this house better than anyone still breathing. Which walls are original limestone from the 1790s, which were added in the 1840s expansion, which chimney draws clean, which one hasn't drawn since the flue collapsed in the winter of 1881. He does not explain why he's here. He does not explain why he came with a lantern and no invitation. He simply says the next thing. "There's a room on the first floor. East corridor, halfway down. Door was plastered over, 60 years ago, maybe longer. You can see it if you know where to look. Slight difference in the surface. The old plaster is horsehair and sand. The patch is Portland cement. Wrong color, wrong texture." Margaret asks nothing. She holds the ledger. She waits. "I never went looking for it," he says. "Wasn't mine to find." That sentence lands like a door closing quietly behind someone who's decided to stay. The next morning she finds it. East corridor, first floor. The wallpaper, 3 layers deep, the outermost a faded moss green, peeling at the seams, shows the faintest rectangular interruption. Not a door anymore. A ghost of a door. The dimensions are wrong for a window. The height of the surrounding plaster changes by a 1/4 inch at the boundary, and when Margaret presses her palm flat against it, the temperature drops. Behind this wall, air hasn't moved in decades. She starts with a kitchen knife, scores through the wallpaper, pulls it back in brittle sheets that crumble like dead leaves. Beneath it, plaster, grey Portland cement, just as Edward described. She chips at the edge, gets through to lath, and behind the lath, brick. Someone bricked this room shut from the inside before the plaster went up. Think about that. Whoever sealed this room was standing in it when the last brick was laid. There must be another way out. A window, a servant's passage. But the deliberateness of it stops her cold. This wasn't neglect. This was intention. First failure. The kitchen knife is useless against brick. Her fingernails are bleeding at the quick. The plaster dust coats her charcoal wool coat, patched at the left elbow with that slightly mismatched grey thread, and she's coughing, and the wall hasn't moved. She sits on the corridor floor with her back against the opposite wall and stares at what she's uncovered. 6 inches of exposed red brick, laid tight, mortared well. Professional work. Whoever did this meant it to last. Edward appears the next morning without being asked. He carries a cold chisel, a mason's hammer, a crowbar, sets them on the floor beside the exposed brick the way a surgeon lays out instruments. Doesn't ask permission, doesn't explain. The folding carpenter's rule comes out of his pocket, and he measures the revealed section. Height, width, mortar depth, then tucks it back. They work. The sound of chisel on mortar is a sharp, ringing crack that echoes down the empty corridor, then a scraping grind as the blade finds the joint between bricks. Edward strikes steady and unhurried. Margaret holds the chisel when his hands need rest, and her blistered palms burn against the cold steel. Brick dust rises in a fine red cloud. The cold is savage. December air pouring through the broken window at the corridor's far end, and neither of them speaks. They don't need to. The rhythm is the conversation. Strike, scrape, pull. Stack the freed brick to the left. Strike again. Her hands blister, crack, bleed. She wraps them in strips torn from a cloth she found in the kitchen and keeps working. Edward notices, says nothing. Works faster so she can rest without asking to rest. By mid-afternoon, they've cleared a gap 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall through the brick. Edward shines the lantern through. The room beyond is a small study, 8 feet by 10. A desk, walnut, simple, a single drawer. A chair pushed in neatly. A window, shuttered from inside, sealed tight. And behind the desk, against the far wall, a panel that doesn't match the surrounding woodwork. The grain runs the wrong direction. The color is a shade too light. The air inside is dry and perfectly still. No damp, no mold. The brick seal kept everything out: moisture, insects, time itself. The desk's surface holds a thin layer of dust so uniform it looks like grey felt. The chair's upholstery is intact. A pen rests in a groove at the desk's edge, as though someone set it down 60 years ago and simply walked away through some passage Margaret cannot yet see. She steps through the gap they've made. Edward stays behind, doesn't cross the threshold. This is hers to find. The false panel behind the desk gives when she presses its lower left corner. A small iron catch releases inside the wall, and the panel swings inward on leather hinges gone stiff with age. Behind it, a cavity in the wall, 18 inches deep. And in that cavity, a tin strongbox, heavy. She lifts it with both wrapped hands, sets it on the desk. The lock on its front is small, brass, oval-shaped. Familiar. Her fingers go to the leather cord at her neck. The tarnished brass skeleton key slides free of her blouse collar. It fits. Behind the false wall of the sealed room, Margaret finds not one document, but a tin strongbox containing a second will, a trust deed, and a letter addressed to the wife of whichever Ashworth son inherits Fenwick Hall. And it is sealed with her name. Margaret turns the brass key in the strongbox lock, and it opens with a sound like a held breath releasing. Inside are 3 documents that will rewrite everything she was told about this house and this family. Her fingers are shaking, not from cold this time, from something closer to fury or recognition, or both at once. The tarnished brass skeleton key on its leather cord swings forward from beneath her cream blouse collar as she bends over the desk, and the grey cat watches from the corner of the sealed room with the patience of something that has waited decades for exactly this. The first document, a will, handwritten in iron gall ink that has gone the colour of dried blood, dated the 14th of March, 1847. The hand is precise, angular, female. Eleanor Ashworth, the grandmother, Thomas and Philip's grandmother, the woman whose initials were carved into the beam downstairs, whose name appeared nowhere in the solicitor's paperwork, whose existence was treated like a footnote in a family that owed her everything. And Eleanor's will does not leave Fenwick Hall to the eldest son. It leaves the estate in trust, held, protected, sealed away from the grabbing hands of men who would sell it for parts, to be inherited by the wife of whichever Ashworth son makes his home here. Not the son, the wife. Eleanor looked at her own family, saw exactly what they were, and built a wall around this house made of law instead of stone. The second document, a trust deed, £4,200 deposited at 3% over 40 years, administered by a solicitor's firm in Cheltenham. Not London, not the local man, not anyone Philip Ashworth ever used or ever would. Because Eleanor didn't trust Philip even as a child. She saw him at 8 years old with his sharp little chin and his grabbing hands, and she knew. She knew what he would become. So she hid the money where his thin, arched brows and his gold, wire-rimmed spectacles and his polished shoes would never think to look. £4,200, at 3%, over 40 years. You do that arithmetic and the number that comes back is enough to rebuild every roof on this estate twice over. The third document is a letter, addressed not to Margaret by name, Eleanor couldn't have known her name, but to the wife of whichever Ashworth son inherits Fenwick Hall. Addressed by title, by role, by the faith that someday, somehow, a woman would stand in this room and read these words. Margaret reads it aloud. Her voice cracks on the third sentence, and she doesn't stop. The men in this family will try to sell. They have always tried to sell. They see walls and calculate timber. They see land and calculate lots. They do not see what a house holds when it is lived in rather than owned. I have sealed this room because what is hidden survives what is contested. If you are standing here, you found the key. If you found the key, you stayed long enough to look. That is enough. That is everything. The grey cat blinks once. The room is silent except for Margaret's breathing, ragged now, uneven, the sound of someone who has been holding herself together with wire and willpower for weeks and has just been handed permission to stop. The scatter of pale freckles across her nose catches the lamplight as she lowers the letter. Her grey-green eyes are wet, but her jaw, that soft, square jaw, is set. And now the ledger makes sense. Every entry, every careful notation in Eleanor's angular hand. The payments to the village, they weren't household expenses. They were acts of deliberate, concealed generosity. Eleanor was paying villagers' debts, funding apprenticeships for young men who couldn't afford a trade, lending without interest to families who would have gone under without it. All of it recorded in the hidden ledger, because if the family had known, they would have stopped her. Philip's father would have stopped her. Philip's grandfather would have stopped her. The men in this family saw charity as weakness and generosity as waste. So Eleanor did what women have always done. She hid the good work inside the walls and let them think they were in charge. One woman. Decades of secret kindness. An entire village held together by money that moved through this house like water through hidden channels. That night, Margaret sits in the one dry bedroom with a single candle burning on the washstand. Philip's original sale documents are spread on the left side of the narrow bed. Eleanor's will is on the right. The charcoal wool coat patched at the left elbow hangs on the door hook, too thin for the cold that seeps through the window frame. She does the arithmetic. Repair costs. The roof alone is £300. The cellar drainage, the replastering, the chimney work, the windows. Set against that, a trust that may or may not still exist at a firm that may or may not still operate, and a will that has been hidden for decades. What court honors a will nobody has seen? What solicitor fights for a document found behind a false wall? By a woman with no resources and no connections. Philip's offer sits there. Clean. Simple. Walk away. Take the money. Start somewhere else with enough to rent 2 rooms and eat for a year. She picks up Philip's papers. Her hand is steady. The arithmetic says, sign. Then her fingers find it. A ridge in the strongbox lining. A fold of leather that shouldn't be there. She pulls it back and there is one more letter, smaller, folded once. The same angular hand, the same iron gall ink gone dark with age. If you are reading this, you stayed. That is all I needed to know. The house chose correctly. Margaret sets Philip's papers down. She does not pick them up again. Morning comes grey and cold and absolute. She is already dressed, the navy skirt with its frayed hem, the scuffed black lace-up boots, the cream blouse buttoned to the throat, with the brass key visible now above the collar for the first time. Not hidden, not tucked away, visible. Philip Ashworth arrives at the estate the following morning with Havisham and a solicitor, expecting to find her gone. Instead, he finds her standing in the kitchen with the strongbox open on the table, Edward at the doorframe behind her, and she says, "Sit down, Philip, there's a second will." Philip Ashworth sits down at the kitchen table, and for the first time in his life has nothing prepared to say. His silver watch chain catches the morning light as his hand stops halfway to his pocket. 3 seconds. That's how long the silence lasts before the mask slides back into place. You can almost hear the gears clicking behind those narrow-set, dark eyes, the thin, arched brows drawing together, the pointed chin lifting just a fraction as he recalculates. Because that's what Philip does. He doesn't feel, he calculates. "Forged," he says, flat, final, like he's stamping a document. One word, and he thinks it closes the conversation. Margaret doesn't move. Her grey-green eyes stay level, her hands resting on either side of the strongbox, the tarnished brass key on its leather cord visible against her cream linen blouse where it slipped free of the collar. She doesn't dignify the accusation with a flinch. Philip's solicitor, a younger man, nervous, brought along because Philip never enters a room without a weapon, leans in and whispers something. Philip nods. "The witnesses," he says, louder now, performative. "I'll need to see the witnesses' signatures verified. Any competent court will require—" "Page 4, Margaret says. "2 witnesses, both named, both registered with the county clerk in 1889. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't need to. Philip's gold, wire-rimmed spectacles catch the light as he tilts his head, scanning the document she's pushed toward him. His thin, compressed lips go thinner. Behind him, Havisham, the developer, the man who thought he was buying Fenwick Hall for back taxes and a handshake, shifts his weight from one foot to the other. He's reading the room faster than Philip is. Businessmen always do. But Philip isn't done. Philip is never done. He turns to his solicitor again, another whispered conference, and you can see it. The way his left hand drifts to the silver watch chain, fingers finding the pocket watch like a rosary, consulting it, as if time itself might rearrange to suit him. "Even if this document were genuine," Philip begins, and, God, the condescension dripping off that word, genuine. Like Margaret pulled this from a cereal box instead of a sealed iron strongbox hidden behind brick and mortar for 40 years. Even if it were genuine, it doesn't address the existing debts against the property. The estate owes nothing. Margaret opens the ledger, the one she found beneath the false bottom, the one with entries going back to 1861 in Eleanor's careful hand. "Your father," she says, turning the book so it faces Philip, "borrowed £600 from this fund in 1874, another 400 in 1879, a third loan, 800, in 1883. Her finger traces the columns, dates, amounts, signatures. None were repaid. The interest alone, compounded at 3% over 40 years, means this estate holds a claim against your inheritance that exceeds what you say is owed." The kitchen goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The quiet of a man realizing the trap he walked into has walls on every side. Philip's jaw works. No sound comes out. His hand tightens on the watch. Havisham clears his throat. "Mr. Ashworth," he says carefully, "I believe my involvement here has reached its natural conclusion." He buttons his coat, picks up his hat, nods once at Margaret. Not warmth exactly, but something close to respect. He's a businessman. He recognizes a legal quagmire the way a sailor recognizes rocks beneath a calm surface. He's not going to wreck his hull on Philip Ashworth's pride. The door closes behind him. One gone. Edward stands in the doorframe, arms folded, the folding carpenter's rule in pale boxwood visible in his breast pocket. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. His presence is the wall at Margaret's back, and Philip knows it. 2 days pass. The solicitor from Eleanor's firm arrives on Thursday morning, not Philip's man, Eleanor's. An elderly clerk named Holloway, white-haired, stooped, carrying a leather case so old the brass fittings have gone green. He inherited this file from his predecessor, who inherited it from the man before. 3 generations of clerks, waiting for someone to present the right key and open the right box and ask the right questions. Holloway sits in the village solicitor's office, a small room with a coal fire and a desk too large for the space, and opens his case with hands that tremble slightly, but know exactly where every document lives. The bank records confirming the trust. £4,200 at 3%, compounded, held in Eleanor Ashworth's name, and transferable upon presentation of the iron key and verification of the second will. The will itself, witnessed and notarized in 1889 by 2 men whose signatures match the county registry. The deed to Fenwick Hall, naming Margaret Ashworth as sole beneficiary upon condition of residence. Philip sits across the table. His back is rigid. His gold, wire-rimmed spectacles reflect the solicitor's lamp. His silver watch chain gleams against his dark charcoal waistcoat. He has not spoken in 11 minutes. If you've made it this far, stay, because what happens next is the part that made me want to tell you this story. Holloway finishes, folds his hands, looks at the village solicitor, who nods once, looks at Margaret, whose charcoal wool coat is patched at the left elbow, whose scuffed black boots have worn heels, who came here with nothing and sat in a ruin and stayed when everything told her to leave. Philip consults his watch one final time. A slow, deliberate movement. Left hand to the silver chain, thumb on the case, click of the lid. He looks at the face. Whatever hour it shows him, it's the hour his claim died. He stands, doesn't speak. His polished black shoes click once, twice, 3 times on the flagstone as he crosses to the door. He doesn't look at Margaret, doesn't look at Edward, doesn't look at Holloway or the village solicitor or the documents spread across the desk that just rewrote 40 years of assumption. The door closes. Silence. The solicitor from the next county confirms the trust is valid, the second will is witnessed and notarized, and the sale to Havisham was conducted without legal authority. Fenwick Hall belongs to Margaret, and the room goes silent. The house is hers. Legally, finally, completely. But 14 rooms don't repair themselves, and £4,200 stretched across decades of decay is not luxury. It is arithmetic. Margaret walks every room with a notebook she found in Eleanor's desk. She writes what she sees. The cellar. 11 inches of standing water, black and still, smelling of iron and rot. The east wing. 14 slates missing from the roof, daylight visible through the gaps, rain damage cascading down through 2 floors of plaster. The kitchen range, choked solid, decades of soot and creosote packed into the flue like geological strata. The drawing room ceiling, buckled in the center, horsehair plaster sagging like a held breath. 6 rooms habitable, 2 with intact roofs and dry walls. The rest, arithmetic. She starts with the cellar. 3 days, bucket by bucket. Her charcoal wool coat hung on a nail by the kitchen door, sleeves of her cream linen blouse rolled past the elbows, the tarnished brass key on its leather cord swinging against her collarbone with each trip up the stone steps. Bucket after bucket carried through the scullery and emptied into the yard drain. Her scuffed black ankle boots soaked through by the second hour of the first day. Her grey-green eyes burning from the smell. 11 inches across a cellar that spans the full footprint of the house. Hundreds of gallons moved by hand, by will, by sheer refusal to stop. By the third evening, the flagstones are exposed. Dark, ancient, beautiful. By the fourth morning, the water is back. 5 inches and rising. She stands at the top of the cellar steps and stares at it. The arithmetic doesn't just fail, it mocks her. 3 days of labor undone overnight. The drain channel along the cellar's east wall runs the wrong direction. Some builder decades ago, incompetent, rushed, or simply drunk, laid the gradient running uphill toward the wall instead of away from it. Every drop that enters the cellar has nowhere to go but back. She doesn't ask Edward. She doesn't have to. He appears on Thursday, always Thursday, no explanation offered, none demanded. His heavy canvas work coat in faded olive green, the folding carpenter's rule visible in his breast pocket, those broad hands already reading the problem before she speaks it. He descends the steps, studies the channel in silence, runs his thumb along the mortar line where stone meets floor. His pale blue eyes track the gradient the way a surgeon reads a wound. Channels laid wrong, has been from the start. 6 words. Then he's back up the steps, fetching a pickaxe from his cart. He redigs the drain channel over that weekend. Margaret works beside him, clearing broken stone, mixing new mortar, holding the spirit level while he checks the fall every 18 inches. His hands, calloused, scarred across the right knuckles from a chisel slip years ago, move with economy. No wasted motion. The new channel drops 3 inches across 12 feet, angling toward the outside wall where he cuts a new outlet through the foundation stone. Monday morning. The cellar is dry. Still dry Tuesday. Still dry the following week. Trust isn't built in declarations. It's built in correction. The first attempt fails. Someone shows up who knows why. The second attempt holds. That's the whole architecture of faith, right there in a drainage channel. Next, the chimney. Margaret loads kindling into the kitchen range, strikes a match. Smoke pours back into the kitchen within seconds, thick and acrid, filling the room until she's coughing against her sleeve, eyes streaming. She damps it down. Tries again with the flue door adjusted. Same result. The range hasn't drawn in 30 years, and it has no intention of starting now. Edward arrives the following Thursday without being told. He studies the chimney pot from outside, squinting up past the ivy. Then he's on the roof, steady, unhurried, his brown leather work boots finding purchase on the moss-slick slate. What he pulls from that flue cap would fill a wheelbarrow. Jackdaw nests, decades of sticks, moss, feathers and bones packed into a solid mass. He lowers it down in a canvas sack, dark, sandy blonde hair pushed back from his forehead, that small, pale birthmark visible on his neck above the collar line. The range draws clean. For the first time in 30 years, heat fills that kitchen. Margaret stands with her palms flat against the warming iron and breathes. Then the community begins to come back. Mrs. Agnes Blackwell arrives on a Wednesday afternoon, moving slowly up the front path with her elm walking stick, the pewter rose brooch pinned at her left collar, her silver-white hair pulled tight in its low bun. She carries a cutting wrapped in damp hessian, a rose stem, dormant but alive. "Your husband's grandmother gave me this stock in 1852. She said the house would need it back someday." One sentence. 40 years of patience held in a dormant root. The following week, a stack of seasoned oak boards appears beside the stable door. No note, no name. Margaret runs her hand along the grain, quarter sawn, properly dried, worth more than she could afford to buy. 2 days later, 3 sacks of lime and a bucket of clean sand sit by the kitchen entrance. Another offering without attribution. The house is calling its debts in, not debts owed to it, debts owed by it. Every quiet generosity Eleanor Ashworth planted over decades, now growing back toward Fenwick Hall like water finding its level. And through all of it, Edward. Every Thursday without fail, fitting a beam in the east wing corridor where rot had weakened the lintel. Margaret holds one end, he holds the other. The corridor is narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people carrying a length of oak. Their shoulders brush as they maneuver it into position. His steady breathing, her grip shifting. Their hands meet on the same section of timber, and neither pulls away for 2 full seconds. A week later, the ladder. Margaret on the 3rd rung, reaching to test the plaster above the drawing room door. Her boot slips on the worn wood. His hand catches hers on the rung. Firm, warm, calloused palm against her knuckles, held one moment longer than necessary, then released. Neither mentions it. On a Thursday evening in late spring, Edward sets down his carpenter's rule on the kitchen table beside her cup and says, "The house is sound now. I don't have a reason to come back tomorrow." And she says, "Then come back without one." 3 years later, Fenwick Hall stands the way Eleanor Ashworth would have wanted it. Not grand, not gleaming, but warm and whole and occupied. The kitchen range draws clean. You can hear it from the hallway, that low, steady pull of air through a flue that hasn't choked since Edward relined it the second time, copper sleeve fitted tight inside the old brick shaft. The smell is bread and coal smoke, and something green from the garden coming through the window Margaret leaves cracked, even in November, because she likes knowing the air outside is moving. The garden blooms where it was wild. Not tamed, never tamed, but shaped. The roses Mrs. Blackwell brought as cuttings 3 years ago climb the south wall now, pale pink against stone that used to be bare and damp. The herb beds follow the old paths Eleanor must have laid out decades ago, because when Margaret pulled the weeds back far enough, the brick edging was already there, waiting. The east wing roof is reslated. You can see the patches if you know where to look. Newer Welsh slate alongside the weathered originals, a shade darker, a fraction thinner. Nobody hides them. Nobody should. They're the proof. 14 rooms, all habitable now. Every one. The cellar is dry and whitewashed, the drain channel recut to fall properly toward the east wall outlet. 11 inches of standing water, gone for good. The lime smell down there is clean, almost sweet. Edward's carpenter's rule, pale boxwood, folding, the one that lived in his coat breast pocket for 3 years of Thursdays, and then every day after, sits on the mantelpiece in the front room beside Eleanor's strongbox. He lives here now. The quiet ending of a courtship conducted entirely in plaster dust and timber, in arguments about load-bearing walls and whether the second bedroom needed new lath or just new lime. He came back without a reason. Then he stayed without one. That's the whole story of it. The grey cat is fat, obscenely, triumphantly fat. It sleeps on the one chair that survived from Eleanor's sealed room, the walnut frame with the worn velvet seat, and it does not move for anyone. It waited longer than any of them. It earned the chair. On a Sunday in October, the kitchen holds a dozen people. Mrs. Agnes Blackwell sits at the head of the table, her elm walking stick hooked over the chair back, the pewter rose brooch at her left collar catching lamplight, her pale, watery eyes sharp as they ever were. The tradesman whose oak boards became the new staircase treads is there, his wife beside him. The solicitor's clerk who first slid the deed across a desk 3 years ago. The woman from the post office who held Margaret's letters when Philip tried to have her mail redirected. A dozen people who owe debts to Eleanor's quiet generosity, gathered not because they were summoned, but because it's October and the kitchen is warm and someone brought cider. They eat, they talk. The conversation overlaps and nobody leads it. Margaret sits at the far end in her charcoal wool coat, patched at the left elbow with slightly mismatched grey thread, still, because she never bought a new one. And the tarnished brass skeleton key still hangs on its leather cord beneath her cream blouse collar. Her grey-green eyes move from face to face. She doesn't say much. She never did. Edward's broad hand rests on the table beside hers, not touching, close enough. Philip Ashworth, somewhere in London with his silver watch chain and his clipped, precise steps, and his absolute certainty that a woman alone couldn't hold an estate, has not written in 18 months. The last letter was 3 lines, something about market value and final offers. She didn't reply. The silence was the answer. The silence was always the answer Philip deserved. Now, one final discovery. While repairing the last bedroom ceiling, The north corner room, the one they saved for last because the cornice was ornate and Edward wanted to match the plasterwork properly. He finds a small tin behind the moulding, wedged tight, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbles when he pulls it free. Inside, a folded paper. Eleanor's hand. That same slanted copperplate from the journals and ledgers, steady even here, even at the end. The house collects people the way a river collects stones. Smooth them, hold them, let them stay. One sentence. That's all she left in the last hiding place. Not money, not a deed, not instructions. Just the truth of what the house was for, written by the woman who understood it first. Margaret reads it at the kitchen table, with plaster dust still in her dark chestnut hair, and says nothing. She folds it. She puts it back in the tin. She sets the tin on the mantelpiece beside the carpenter's rule and the strongbox. The collection is complete. If you've made it this far, stay, because the house isn't finished choosing. A Thursday evening in November. Rain coming sideways off the moor. The kind of rain that finds every gap in a coat, every worn seam, every patch that wasn't stitched tight enough. A woman stands at the gate. She's young, maybe 25, in a coat too thin for the season. A valise in her right hand, scuffed at the corners, held together with a belt because the clasp broke. She looks at Fenwick Hall the way Margaret looked at it 3 years ago. Not with hope. With the specific exhaustion of someone who has tried everything else, and this is what remains. Nothing behind her, everything uncertain ahead. The gate is open. It's always open now. Margaret sees her from the kitchen window. She doesn't ask Edward who she is. She doesn't check for a letter of introduction. She doesn't hesitate. She walks to the front door, past the roses, past the repaired step, past the threshold she crossed alone 3 years ago in her scuffed black lace-up boots with worn heels, and she opens it. No questions, no conditions. She steps aside. The cycle continues. Because every estate sold for nothing, every woman told to walk away, every wall that holds more than plaster and lath, the pattern repeats. The houses keep choosing. They find the ones who'll stay when everything says leave. They hold what others discarded. They wait. Margaret opens the door without asking for a story. She steps aside. The cycle continues. Because the house was never the inheritance, the willingness to stay when everything said leave, that was the inheritance.